Sarah's last delivery of the night glowed on her phone screen as she navigated her car through the rain-slicked streets of Maple Grove. The familiar rhythm of food deliveries had become second nature during her evening shifts at Golden Dragon, the local Chinese restaurant. But tonight something felt off. Mr. Chen's order wasn't there. The elderly gentleman who, without fail, ordered vegetable lo mein and spring rolls every Tuesday at 6 p.m. sharp. His absence from the order queue created an unsettling void in her routine. Mr. Chen wasn't just another customer. He was a retired music teacher who always greeted her with a gentle smile and often shared stories about his days teaching piano to neighborhood children. Sometimes she'd even hear soft melodies drifting from his old upright piano as she approached his porch. Sarah checked her watch. 6:30 p.m. Her shift was technically over, but the absence of his order gnawed at her. Following an impulse she couldn't quite explain, she placed his usual order herself and headed toward the quiet street where he lived. The Victorian-style houses along Cedar Lane were usually alive with warm, inviting lights, but tonight an unusual darkness had settled over the neighborhood. Mr. Chen's house, normally illuminated by the soft glow of his antique porch lamp, stood in complete darkness. The sight sent a shiver down her spine. She remembered how he'd once mentioned that music and light were his ways of keeping loneliness at bay. "When you get to be my age," he'd said with a wistful smile, "silence can become too heavy to bear." Sarah approached the front door, the familiar takeout bag in hand. "Mr. Chen?" she called out, knocking gently. No response. She knocked again, louder this time. After what felt like an eternity, she heard shuffling footsteps. The door opened just enough to reveal Mr. Chen, but the man before her barely resembled the cheerful person she knew. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his face drawn and tired. Most concerning was the fear that flickered in his eyes when he saw her. "Sarah, you shouldn't be here," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The usual warmth in his voice was replaced by trembling uncertainty. "I brought your regular order," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "I noticed you hadn't called tonight." Mr. Chen's hands, those skilled fingers that had taught countless students to play beautiful melodies, now trembled as they gripped the doorframe. "That's very kind, but I'm not hungry tonight. Please, you should go." Sarah's instincts screamed that something was wrong. The house was silent, no piano music, no gentle humming that usually accompanied his evening routine. Through the narrow opening, she caught glimpses of scattered papers and overturned furniture. "Mr. Chen, are you sure everything's all right?" she pressed gently. "You don't seem yourself." He hesitated, conflict evident on his face. Before he could respond, a sharp crash echoed from inside the house, followed by a muffled voice. Mr. Chen's face paled. "I'm fine," he insisted, but his voice cracked. "Please, just leave." As the door began to close, Sarah made a quick decision. She couldn't just walk away. Instead of returning to her car, she walked to the house next door where Mrs. Patterson, a longtime resident, lived. Mrs. Patterson opened her door, still wearing her gardening apron despite the late hour. Her face grew serious as Sarah explained her concerns. "Now that you mention it," Mrs. Patterson said, lowering her voice, "I've seen some strange men coming and going from his house lately. They claim to be from some investment company, but something about them seems off. Poor Richard, Mr. Chen, he's been so withdrawn lately." Sarah's next stop was the house across the street where Mark Thompson, a local police officer, lived. He listened intently to her observations, his professional instincts kicking in as she described the changes in Mr. Chen's behavior. "Those men have been pressuring several elderly residents in the area," Officer Thompson revealed, his expression grim. "They're running a sophisticated scam, targeting people who live alone. We've been building a case, but we need evidence." Sarah's heart raced as she and Officer Thompson made their way back to Mr. Chen's house. The sound of raised voices now drifted through the darkness, confirming their worst fears. "Stay behind me," Officer Thompson whispered, reaching for his phone to call for backup. But before he could dial, a crash and a frightened cry from inside spurred them into immediate action. Officer Thompson moved swiftly to the front door while Sarah, remembering Mr. Chen once mentioning a back entrance through his garden, hurried around the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see two men in expensive suits looming over Mr. Chen, who sat trembling in his piano bench, clutching a stack of papers. "Just sign the papers, old man," one of them growled. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "This house, it's all I have left of my Catherine," Mr. Chen replied, his voice shaking but determined. "My wife and I built our life here. I won't let you take it." Sarah's blood boiled at the sight. She pulled out her phone and started recording through the window, capturing their intimidation tactics. At that moment, Officer Thompson's authoritative voice boomed through the front of the house. "Police, open up!" The scammers' heads snapped up in panic. As they tried to flee through the kitchen, they found Sarah blocking the back door, her phone held high, still recording. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said firmly. As Officer Thompson entered through the front, his presence commanding the room, within minutes, backup arrived and the two men were handcuffed and led away. They were part of a larger organization that had been preying on elderly homeowners across 3 states, using intimidation to force them to sell their homes at fraction of their worth. Mr. Chen sat in his favorite armchair, wrapped in a blanket Sarah had found, as he gave his statement to the police. His hands had stopped shaking and some color had returned to his face. The lo mein she'd brought sat warming on the coffee table, its familiar aroma bringing a sense of normalcy back to the house. "I was so ashamed," he admitted quietly to Sarah. "They found out about my medical bills, my late mortgage payments after Catherine's passing. They said they were investors who could help, but then..." He trailed off, his eyes distant. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Sarah assured him, gently placing her hand over his. "These people are professionals at exploiting vulnerability, but you're not alone anymore." In the days that followed, the community rallied around Mr. Chen. Mrs. Patterson organized a neighborhood watch program. Officer Thompson connected Mr. Chen with legitimate financial advisors and elder care services. Sarah helped him sort through his paperwork and set up automatic bill payments. Most importantly, life began returning to normal. The porch light glowed warmly again each evening, and the sound of piano music once more drifted through the neighborhood. Mr. Chen's Tuesday order of lo mein and spring rolls resumed its regular place in Sarah's delivery schedule, but now their brief interactions had evolved into something more meaningful. One evening, as Sarah delivered his usual order, she found him sitting at his piano, playing a piece she'd never heard before. "I composed it myself," he said, smiling at her surprised expression. "I'm calling it The Guardian Angel's Song. It's about a young woman who delivers more than just food. She delivers hope." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as the beautiful melody filled the room. What had started as a simple act of concern had blossomed into a profound connection that transformed both their lives. As she drove home that night, Sarah reflected on how sometimes the smallest decisions, like noticing a missing order, could lead to the most significant impacts. The neighborhood felt different now, warmer somehow, as if Mr. Chen's music had awakened something in all of them. A reminder that community wasn't just about living side by side, but about looking out for one another. Mr. Chen continued teaching piano, his students now including several neighborhood children whose parents paid in both money and home-cooked meals. Sarah often stopped by, even on non-delivery days, to share stories and listen to him play. His house became a gathering place for neighbors, filled with music, laughter, and the kind of warmth that no scammer could ever take away. And every Tuesday at 6 p.m., without fail, Sarah would arrive with his order, but she brought more than just Chinese food. She brought friendship, trust, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, someone was watching out for him. The scammers had been right about one thing. Mr. Chen's house was valuable, but not for its market price. Its true worth lay in the community it helped build, the music it shared, and the friendship it fostered, things that no amount of money could ever buy.